in the room have an understanding of the 100, but just sort of by way of background, obviously this was the new ECB tournament introduced in 2021, based on cricket, but a slightly different format, a city-based franchise competition. But one of the key premises behind it was that the ECB said that this was part of their long-term commitment to making cricket a gender-balanced sport. So they were trying to set this up, as we've said on the screen, for leveling the playing fields. Some of the unique aspects to it were that there were equal sort of men's and women's teams, so both men's and women's teams for each of the franchises. And one of the big selling points was that they said there would be equal prize money for the men's and women's teams. Although there were equal prize money, some things such as the salaries were not equal. So there's a few things that that sort of play out and things that we want to look at in this. As you can see from the slide, the research was conducted alongside Women in Sport, charity organisation, and they helped us with all aspects of the study. So from the design through to the distribution of the survey, they had a lot more contacts and a lot more followers on social media than both Raf and myself did, and so that enabled us to reach a wider audience for it. Yeah, we conducted this research just after the first year, so we haven't got the views of people following years 1 and 2, but yeah, we've got the initial perceptions, and our focus was on two aspects. Firstly, the match day experience, because that was something that we didn't think had been looked at, and still hasn't really been looked at in much detail. And the second one was whether this tournament managed to change the perceptions of cricket, and in particularly of women's cricket. So those are what we set out to do. So bear with me while I just click across. Okay, so we had a number of key research questions, as you can see on the screen here. These were underpinned by some of the desires by the ECB, so one of which was to try and attract a more diverse audience. And we know from existing ECB research that the overwhelming audience for cricket in the UK remained overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white British, and had an average age of around about 50. So I'll let you draw inferences to the type of demographic there. So that was some of the premise behind introducing this new tournament, trying to diversify the audience. So our questions then that we asked people were, why did they choose to attend the 100? So what was it about this new competition that people wanted to engage with? Then we were looking at what could be done to improve the match day experience, to understand what people liked about it, what they didn't like it. And one of the key billings of the tournament was that from the outset it was meant to be family friendly. So we looked to interrogate that to try and understand if this really was a family friendly tournament, to allow them to attract this younger, more diverse audience. We looked to see if the tournament did change perceptions of cricket, and as I said earlier, perceptions of women's cricket. And then we were trying to understand whether this tournament, the 100, could serve as a gateway into engaging with other forms of cricket, to understand if once people had gone to this, they were more likely to come and watch other forms such as Test cricket or even county championship cricket. And Raf, I will hand over to you now.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, so in terms of the data that we collected, there was an online survey that was completed by anyone who'd attended one or more matches in the 100 in 2021, and we had 245 responses to the survey, 163 from men and 78 from women. We then followed the survey up by curating various different focus groups, which took place in July 2022 with 18 participants, 11 men and 7 women. So we used data from the survey to form kind of specific subgroups who we felt were of particular interest given our research questions. So those subgroups represented people who were already engaged with both men's and women's cricket prior to the 100, people who'd never watched any cricket before, people who'd never watched women's cricket before, people whose involvement with cricket had increased as a result of attending the 100, and also a specific subgroup of those who'd attended the 100 with children in order to enable us to examine that family-friendly aspect. I think I'm handing back over to you at this point, KP.
And I've got to remember to unmute myself. God, this is bringing back memories of what it was like teaching online for all that time. So yeah, this is the slide here is why people chose to attend the 100, and especially if they'd never attended cricket before. So some of the findings here are sort of fairly obvious. The most important reason that people cited was an existing love of cricket. So people generally had been involved with cricket, had watched cricket, loved cricket before, so they wanted to just come and see cricket. And we found that most people didn't care about the format to a large extent. It was just because it's cricket. They're happy to come and watch it. However, of these, or of our sample, 70% said that they wanted to experience a new format. So there were a number of innovations in it. The 100 balls being one, the change from 6 balls to 5 balls as the standard sort of measure. So people wanted to see what this new format was like. In the first year, it was novel, it was new, it was different, and that was exciting for some people. For 52%, they said to socialise. So whether that was with family or with friends, and we'll sort of interrogate that a little bit later on, but it was part of it. It wasn't coming just to see cricket, it was also to socialise and to have a good time out. And one of the slightly less frequent responses, was that it was cheaper than other forms of cricket. We know that, for instance, Test match cricket now can be fairly expensive, so this was marketed as always being relatively affordable and accessible. Now, interestingly, the aspects such as live music and wanting to support their city were less important factors for our participants. And that supporting the city was particularly interesting because, as I said earlier, these were city-based franchises, which moved away from the traditional county structure for the long format, or even for some of the short forms of cricket that we get in the UK. We also saw that the double headers that they had in a number of games were seen as being really good value for money. So when that was the men's and the women's game held straight after each other, that was a contributing factor. And Raf is going to talk a bit more about that later. Oh, where's my thing? There we go. So in terms of the match day experience, most people said that they were either very satisfied or satisfied with the match day experience. So from an ECB perspective and from the franchise's perspective, that's certainly good to see that people generally enjoyed it when they were there. However, and we should add a bit of a caveat that we had a fairly monocultural sample size, but those who were from ethnically diverse backgrounds did have a lower satisfaction rate, or statistically lower satisfaction rate, when compared with spectators who identified as white British. We had 72 respondents who said that the quality of the cricket was the most important and enjoyable part of their day. So the quality of the cricket, again, as we said here, that's what people are going for. They're coming because they love cricket, because they want to watch cricket, and the high quality of it was an important one in there. So there's a few considerations. Like I say, it's a small sample size, so we do think that there needs to be more interrogation of spectators who are from diverse backgrounds. To give you an idea of some of the qualitative response here, give you an idea of what people said. So the first one, the general vibe about the place was on a different level, very much like a family gathering type thing. Not that families don't go to a blast game, but it just had that difference. It felt like something fresh was going on for sure. And there was a lot of comments made to compare it to the atmosphere at blast games, and we'll touch on what that might be later on. You can see the second quote on the slide there. They said, probably the most diverse crowd I've seen at a cricket match. So it does look like there was something different going on. We were getting a different type of spectator who was coming to watch this, and it was generally an enjoyable experience there. So crowd diversity was certainly something that the ECB had been looking for there. So was it family friendly? Well, a lot of people who went, so 86% of teenagers and 80% of children who enjoyed it, according to those they attended with. So we didn't actually talk to the children, we talked to the parents, but the parents generally said their kids had a good time. So teenagers in particular, but most children generally had a good time and generally enjoyed it. And of those who attended with children, the vast majority said that they would plan to take their children or teenagers again the following year. So it was seen as being something that was suitable for taking children to. Some of the qualitative responses, just delving down into it a little bit more. So the first one, the fact that it was the women's and the men's was actually really important for the daughter because she likes seeing that representation. And I think this is really important. We did see that there was this visibility of women's cricket and of women's cricketers that was really important. Whereas in the past, it's perhaps been hidden away to an extent. Here we're getting the women's game front and foremost. And in the first year of the tournament, for those who don't remember, that the very first match was a women's game. So it did open with a women's game. And we did have some women's games that were on in the primetime TV slot, but we'll come on to that a little bit later as well. The last quote here, so my daughter absolutely adored it, and she has now joined a cricket club, and I'm taking her again later on this summer with one of her friends. So that, I think, really highlights the importance of having these visible women's cricketers for role models for the younger generation. So allowing people to see them and to see that there is a career that can be made from cricket. We're seeing the salaries going up and the increased professionalisation of the game, that it's now setting this aspirational sort of opportunity for young girls to see that they can play cricket at the highest level and actually make a career out of it. Sorry, every time I stop, my cursor disappears. There we go. So, however, there were a couple of comments that are worth noting, and this was actually picked up in some of the media coverage around the tournament as well. So towards the, or certainly in the second game, or towards the end of the game when it was an evening game, they did notice about there being a slight atmosphere change. So whereas it had been nice and family friendly, either in the women's game or earlier on in the day, as the evening wore on or as the day wore on, you can see here it was said to descend into a typical T20 type of atmosphere. So more male, more alcohol being drunk, and worse behaviour. The comment here says perhaps that's a reflection of the children going home to bed or people coming in after work. And it did seem to be particularly the sort of certainly the bigger city-based venues where people were coming in after work and where they'd been working late and perhaps blowing off a bit of steam here. So here there is perhaps a little bit of a suggestion that there's a clash between the two visions of the tournament. So one is this family-friendly atmosphere, and the second one is more of an alcohol-fueled T20 type atmosphere that we've seen in a number of the other tournaments. So there is a need for work to ensure that this does not become the case, that it doesn't transform into this type of atmosphere. So we have sort of made some suggestions around limiting the sale of alcohol or having more family-only areas, better training for stewards and for as examples. But there's certainly something there to be done, a little bit more work to be done. And over to you, Raf.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, so on to this question of whether or not the 100 changed people's perceptions of cricket. So interestingly, the majority of our survey respondents, 72%, said that the 100 hadn't changed their perceptions of cricket. And when you delve a little bit more deeper into that and the kind of reasons for that perception not changing, the message tends to come across that it was people who already loved cricket. So why would the 100, they were saying to us, why would the 100 kind of change our perception of cricket, or my perception of cricket? It's basically the same as a T20 game, just a little bit shorter. So that's the message about the reason kind of why potentially it's not changed people's perceptions of cricket. But a couple of interesting kind of statistics within that, if you delve a little bit deeper into the data, is that new fans were more likely to have had their perceptions of cricket changed. So 43% compared to 23% of existing supporters. So we're seeing that people who whose exposure to cricket prior to this has been limited, or who wouldn't have necessarily gone along to a more traditional form of cricket, are having their sport changed. Some of them are having their perception of the sport changed by their experience of the 100. And the other interesting point is that more women than men, so 36% compared to 24%, said that the 100 had changed their perceptions of cricket, which is probably a bit of a success story for the ECB, who are kind of trying to attract this slightly more diverse audience. So if women are kind of coming along to the 100 and changing their perception of cricket as a result, then that's probably positive. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so a few quotes here about reasons why people's perception had changed of cricket. So in what ways and why had the 100 changed perceptions of cricket for that kind of minority who felt that it had changed their perceptions? So I watched a lot of the tournament at home, and I thought the coverage was different in a good way and inclusive. My partner also watched with me and enjoyed it more, whereas she never really has before. So echoing some of those messages that Keith was talking about earlier about this perception of the 100 as kind of being a bit more inclusive, people therefore kind of more prepared to engage with it or attracting a slightly different audience. I thought it was dull, confusing, and for posh boys beforehand. Now I understand it and really enjoy it. So again, it's engaging people who wouldn't have necessarily engaged with your traditional formats of cricket. And finally, it showed the game can reach more people and be far more inclusive than it already is. The crowds were diverse and enthusiastic, and it felt like such a big shift from the overwhelmingly middle class, middle-aged and white audience usually found at county matches. I think that last comment, so our research was obviously carried out before the ICEC report was kind of carried out and published, but that last comment really kind of speaks to some of those issues that cricket is facing overall as a sport in terms of that kind of lack of inclusivity. And this particular respondent is saying that they feel that the 100 kind of overcomes some of, or begins to overcome some of those issues of lack of diversity. So again, that's probably speaking to the fact that the 100 can potentially be quite an important tournament and an important aspect in the ECB's response to the ICEC findings. Can I have the next slide, please, Keith? So on to whether the 100 changed perceptions of women's cricket specifically. So here is another big win for the ECB, we feel, because what we're seeing is that more men than women said that the 100 had changed their perceptions of women's cricket. So 49% of men compared to 40% of women. And the general reasons offered for that are that it seems that many men hadn't had very much engagement with women's cricket beforehand, and those who hadn't were quite surprised at how good it is, in fact. So a quote on the slide: "The amount of advance in the women's game in the last 20 years is astronomical, and it's a brilliant watch." So this idea that actually if you do encourage that exposure to women's sport and women's cricket in that instance, then people will realise how good it is. So that's very positive. We also saw in the focus groups actually that there was a significant advance in kind of name recognition awareness of particular women's players. So you had men in the focus groups who might never have engaged with women's cricket beforehand, name dropping players like Alice Capsey and Lauren Bell, who at the point at which we did this research, neither of them had played for England. So that kind of incredible sort of advance in knowledge and understanding of women's domestic cricket is something that has never previously been seen in this country. The other really interesting thing that kind of came out in some of the focus groups was actually men, some of whom, again, whose exposure to an interest in women's cricket had previously been limited, were actually themselves critiquing the gender disparities that the 100 has to some extent highlighted. So one male in one of our focus groups said, "I thought by miles the worst thing that happened for the 100 last year was when there was this game at Lords where the women's game was completed, it rained, the men's game didn't even start, and the ECB decided to issue 100% ticket refunds, which was not a good look." So I don't know if people remember that particular instance. There was quite a lot of controversy about it at the time, but the key point here is that one of our focus group attendees actually remembered this and was kind of calling the ECB out for their attitude towards women's cricket. And that's something that we think is probably quite a kind of new phenomenon, is men actually critiquing gender disparities. Can I have the next slide, please, Keith? One thing that we felt was really important about the 100 was the double header model. So 28% of our respondents had never watched women's cricket before, but of our respondents who'd all been to the 100 in that first year, 87% of them. So the overwhelming majority had watched both the men's and the women's matches. A couple of comments on the slide that kind of speak to that. Somebody said, you know, I was strong-armed into watching the women's game, but I was really glad that I was. Somebody else saying, you know, I probably wouldn't have bothered to go if I'd had to choose between the men's and the women's. But actually now I would be really keen to go and see women's cricket, and specifically kind of in this instance talking about Nat Siver and Catherine Brunt. So again, it speaks to that idea of people having their perceptions of women's cricket changed, and that actually that being attributable to this double header model. And I think what's really interesting, and again this happened relatively recently, is that the ECB have announced that they are moving women's domestic cricket away from the existing regional model back into it's going to be run by some of the counties. So I think that is partly as a result of the success of double headers in the 100. They see that having those aligned team identities and team brands has been successful in terms of engaging a fan base and engaging people to want to watch that women's team if it has that aligned identity. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, we've basically come to the conclusion, just to say that the report of this research is available publicly. If you Google levelling the playing field, the 100 and Bournemouth University, then a link will come up and we can maybe arrange for that link to be circulated as well. But otherwise, thanks very much for listening, and we're happy to spend a few minutes taking questions.
Thank you, Raf. I'm going to stop the recording for the questions, I think, if that's okay with everybody.